Hi, my name is Kevin Bryan. Welcome to Wildlife Behavior Exam 1, presented by me. In 1963, Nico Tinbergen came up with 4 questions which form the roots of studying wildlife behavior. They are, how does it work? How did it develop? What is it for? And how did it evolve? Now, let's break these down a little bit further. How does it work? This is really asking, how does the body produce the behavior? This is an approximate control question looking at the current mechanism. What factors cause an individual to perform this behavior? When considering this, we want to look at psychological factors, physical factors, internal and external factors as well. How did the behavior develop? How does the behavior develop and what influences its final form? This is an approximate question addressing the life history and ontogeny of the behavior within an individual. Does the behavior change or develop over the period of an individual's lifetime? If it does, how does it do so? And what are the influences on its final form? What is it for? How does the behavior help the animal's survival and reproduction? This question is ultimate, looking at the current function of the behavior. What is the survival value of the behavior? Does it increase the survival rate of the species? If so, how? How does it contribute to reproductive success, also known as fitness? The more reproductive success that a trait brings, the more desirable it is typically. How did the behavior evolve? So how has evolutionary history contributed to the behavior, and what behaviors did ancestral groups perform? This is an ultimate question looking at the phylogenetic or evolutionary history of the behavior. What factors could be involved in shaping the behavior we are looking at? How has the behavior been formed through the animal's adaptability and construction of their environment? How has evolutionary history contributed to a behavior? Again, looking at that evolutionary factor. And to do this, we can look at a phylogenetic tree to help us understand where the behavior likely stemmed from. So if you look at this phylogenetic tree here, you can see some of the places that things have stemmed off, such as right here where the pointer is, some of those places. So today we'll be looking at the foraging behavior of Galapagos marine iguanas, more specifically how this species dives for algae in coastal waters of the Galapagos Islands. So how does the diving behavior in Galapagos marine iguanas occur? Galapagos marine iguanas forage for algae in coastal waters of the Galapagos Islands, and they can dive to a depth of 30 meters. They typically jump into the ocean and immediately inflate their lungs for buoyancy to avoid drowning. They swim with their entire body, similar to the way that a snake would or a crocodile. To dive, they swim in a downward position and they must overcome their own buoyancy. Then when they get down to the bottom, they hold on to rocks where the algae is with their long, sharp claws. They are able to eat the algae a little more easily with their short nose and sharp teeth, and then they're able to return to the surface a little easier than they got down due to that increased buoyancy with their lungs being inflated. And here's a link to a video if you're interested in watching them. So how does the diving behavior develop throughout the lifetime of an individual? So as hatchlings, they forage exclusively on the rocks exposed at low tide, not entering the water voluntarily at all. Then as the iguana grows older, they begin to swim in the water. And larger individuals are better swimmers as they produce more thrust while swimming, and this allows them to travel further away from land and endure rougher seas, and potentially they're able to get food sources that smaller iguanas are not able to access, increasing their fitness. So what is the diving behavior in Galapagos marine iguanas for? This behavior helps the animals survive because they're able to utilize a food source which other reptiles on the island do not. This means that there's less competition on land and potentially less harmful interactions between individuals within that species and between different species. These marine iguanas are still able to utilize the terrestrial environment where there is a lack of food, and they can use that for things like nesting and basking in the sun, and then they forage for their food in the ocean. And then even larger individuals are potentially able to access more food sources, and this can give them higher reproductive success. So how did the diving behavior evolve in these marine iguanas? So their closest living relative is this Galapagos land iguana here, Conolophus pallidus, and they likely diverged either from these land iguanas or both of them diverged from a common ancestor. So some of the adaptations that the marine iguana has versus the land iguana are that the marine iguana, pictured on the left here, has a much longer flattened tail to improve thrust and propulsion through the water. They also have these salt glands in their nose, which cause these white crystals, salt-like crystals, to happen on their face, and they're able to snort out excess salt, which they ingest during feeding. And these salt glands have much increased speed of osmoregulation compared to other iguana species. The short snout that they have compared to the land iguana makes it much easier to access the algae, and they actually also have digestion adaptations that help them digest the marine algae. So moving on, the organizational effects of hormones on wildlife behavior. These are typically permanent on changes to the structure and function of the body of the individual which they occur to. They typically occur during development of the fetus or sometimes during critical developmental periods, such as in humans that could be puberty. An example which I came up with would be the transformation of a frog or a tadpole to a frog. So this is induced by a hormone which causes the tadpole to start absorbing its tail and growing legs. They also absorb their gills and begin to grow lungs. Activational effects of hormones are immediate and temporary effects on the body, and they can come and go with the presence or absence of the hormone. A good example of this would be a male elk growing antlers during the rut due to an increase in testosterone. And during the rut, the elk become much more aggressive, and then after the testosterone starts to dissipate in their body, they will lose that aggression, and they also lose the antlers that they grow during the rut. Organizational effects of hormones versus activational effects of hormones. So organizational effects are permanent changes to the individual, while activational effects are immediate and temporary changes. Activational effects have the ability to come and go, and the effects are typically only present at the time that the hormone is present and active. Then they revert after the hormone is no longer present or active, while organizational effects occur while the hormone is active and will remain for the entire life of the individual. And oftentimes, organizational effects can take much longer to occur. So, in the example that we had of the elk, those antlers come and go every year. In the example of the frog, that happens once in their life, and it is permanent for the rest of their entire life. All right, now let's get into some behavioral studies. So a cross-sectional behavioral study looks at a population at a specific time period, and they show the average of all the individuals. Some of the advantages of cross-sectional behavioral studies include the ability to give a picture of a population at a certain time or under certain parameters. Also, the ability to measure population or group performance at a specific point. Some of the disadvantages of cross-sectional behavioral studies include increased between-group variabilities. This means that different groups may vary in ways that are not merely the result of an independent variable. Another disadvantage is if the same individual is tested multiple times, they can learn as they grow older, thus confounding results. Individuals can also develop in different ways, and this is not well shown in a cross-sectional behavioral study due to the fact that they take an average of all individuals, and this can overestimate the results of the study. An example that I came up with for a good cross-sectional behavioral study would be looking at when moose in general as a population are most active and when their highest activity is during the day. So, longitudinal behavioral studies look at individual change in performance over a function of time or other independent factors. So, some of the advantages of a longitudinal behavioral study are that they allow us to better observe or see and understand behaviors or other things which take a long time to occur. And we can easily distinguish between individuals in these kinds of studies. Some of the disadvantages include problems with repeating test subjects. So, results can become very difficult or confusing if the same subjects are repeatedly tested. And depending upon what is being tested for, individuals could potentially learn from the study, and thus with skewing the results as well. And then an example that I came up with for longitudinal behavioral study would be to look at when individual whale sharks begin their migration towards their breeding grounds instead of looking at the population as a whole. So some of the differences between cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies would be that cross-sectional studies investigate things at a specific point or set period in time, while longitudinal studies investigate things over a long period of time. Cross-sectional behavioral studies look at the average or mean of a population, while longitudinal studies show results of each individual. And that can be a huge difference, showing something. If you look at the average, you could see an incorrect interpretation that it happens over a long period of time, when really it may happen rapidly over different periods of time for individuals. Cross-sectional studies tend to generalize things and can seem to overestimate results, while longitudinal studies are typically more specific and show individuals. Longitudinal studies can go for much longer periods of time than cross-sectional studies. All right, so getting into the signaling now. So cooperative signaling, in this kind of signaling, there is a benefit to both the sender and the receiver. And a good example that I came up with for cooperative signaling would be a male cricket sending out a mating call to a female cricket who receives the mating call. They end up mating and having young from this signal. The male, who is the sender in this scenario, benefits from successfully sending a mating signal, getting a mate, successfully mating, and passing on his genes to the offspring. The female cricket in this scenario, who is the receiver, benefits from receiving the call, choosing this male as her mate, successfully mating, and passing on her genes to the offspring as well, thus benefiting both individuals. A dishonest signal is where there is a net gain or benefit to the signaler and a cost to the receiver. A very common form of dishonest signaling is Batesian mimicry, where a non-venomous species mimics the patterns of a venomous species. So a good example, other than Batesian mimicry, that I came up with of dishonest signaling would be an alligator snapping turtle using its lingual lure or tongue, which looks like a worm, to mimic a worm, while it sits completely still for its prey, which would be a fish, to come by. In this scenario, the snapping turtle is a signaler, and it benefits from the interaction by sending a false signal of its lingual lure or tongue and gaining a meal. The receiver in this scenario is the fish, which has a net cost of its life because it becomes the prey for the turtle. So incidental signaling, sometimes called a cue, has a net cost to the sender while the receiver benefits. An example that I came up with for this is a frog sends out a mating call, but instead of attracting a mate, he has attracted a bat who flies down and eats the frog for dinner. In this scenario, the frog, who is the sender, has a net cost of its life, becoming prey. The bat, who is the receiver, has a net benefit of a meal. So spiteful signaling is a net cost to both the sender and the receiver. This is actually very rare in the wild, and it really only happens among humans and primates. However, an example that I was able to come up with for this would be a person who commits arson, and they get caught and convicted of the crime and go to jail. So the sender in this situation who commits the arson, from this interaction, they end up in jail, which is their net cost. And then the receiver, in this scenario, who is the victim, they end up with a net cost as well because their stuff got burnt down. So now we will go over the paper, which was by Jagielski et al. In 2021, looking at polar bear foraging on common eider eggs, estimating the energetic consequences of a climate-mediated behavioral shift. So, polar bears, their scientific name is Ursus maritimus, and they're the largest species of bear in the world. Polar bears live in the northern Arctic, as seen in the range map here on the left. And they historically forage for seals on the ice until summer. And this is supposed to make up a majority of their diet and allow them to build up a fat reserve for the summer when they're not able to hunt these seals. However, more recently, the polar bears have been pushed to terrestrial environments much earlier in the season than their historic range shows, and due to this, the IUCN lists them as a vulnerable species. So the common eider, which was discussed in this paper, is a surface diving waterfowl which live mostly in the northern regions of the world. They are a ground nesting waterfowl nesting in the Arctic, and their common nesting habitats consist of low coastal islands and shorelines with small short vegetation. Their common food source include aquatic invertebrates, and their conservation status is of low concern. So the study was conducted in the East Bay Migratory Bird Sanctuary of Middevick Island in Nunavut, Canada. And here's some pictures of it popping up. And this is a seasonally ice-free area, meaning that it only has ice on it during parts of the season. It's a low-lying tundra. The elevation is typically below 8 meters. It has granite rock throughout the island, and it has various small ponds throughout the island as well, which is perfect breeding grounds for these common eiders. So the purpose of this study was to investigate the costs and benefits of polar bears foraging for and consuming eider eggs, which helps. This kind of study helps to look at and understand the adaptive capacity of polar bears responding to human-induced rapid ecological change. And to investigate this, these researchers quantified and analyzed or estimated the energetic consequences of foraging on novel resources. And they really hope that this kind of model can be put to other animals undergoing similar stressors due to rapid ecological change by humans in the future. And hopefully we can find a resolution for that kind of thing. So the methodology used by these researchers is that they actually use drones to record polar bears foraging on these eider eggs. And they had a lookout stations around the island where they could observe polar bears coming to the island. And then these lookout individuals notified the drone operator, and there was only one of them, via radio, and that person was inside an electric fence for safety reasons. And then with the drone, they recorded polar bears from 30 to 55 meters above them so that they would not disturb them. And because they were so far away, the sex was not accurately able to be determined, so they had a little issues with that. And the bears were recorded during the hours of 05:30, which is 5 a.m., and 20:30, which is 8:30 p.m. And they were recorded as long as they were active and on the island, and they began recording as soon as these bears got to the island, and they stopped recording as soon as either the bear went to sleep or the bear left the island. So this paper defined a foraging bout as an observation of a single bear continuously foraging, but this could be composed of one or more flights by the drone as a result of the limitations of the battery, which was about 22 minutes for each drone. And then they differentiated between the bears based on a combination of conspicuous markings, the size of the bear, the ability of the researchers to keep track of the total numbers of bears observed per day, and the time and date of each video filming or video recording. Alright, so let's look at some mathematical calculations used in this study. This study analyzed the cost of foraging for the eggs by the polar bears and how much energy they would gain from each egg. The formulas they used in this study was VO2 equals 0.44 plus 0.12 times speed. So in this formula, VO2 is the maximum consumption of oxygen typically used. So this is also known as volume of oxygen, and this was measured in milliliters or ml of oxygen O2 per gram per hour. They measured speed in kilometers per hour, and 1 liter of oxygen consumed is equal to 19.66 kilojoules. So for bears moving at a walking pace, they estimated the walking speed to be 3.4 kilometers per hour. For the site of study, relatively flat. And then this resulted in an energetic cost while walking of approximately 16.67 kilojoules per kilogram per hour. And then a speed of 0 kilometers per hour was used to estimate energy use rate when polar bears were ingesting eggs or not moving, and not moving was defined as standing, sitting, or lying down. And this produced an energy use rate of 8.65 kilojoules per kilogram per hour, which is approximately 40% higher than a polar bear's resting metabolism use rate, which could be a big issue for them. So the findings and conclusions of this study were that although it may be sufficient for an individual or a single polar bear, foraging on eggs will not be sufficient for polar bears as a species to survive off of during the summer. These eggs are likely one of the most cost-efficient resources for the bears during the summer season. As the bears eat the eggs, depleting the source, the energy cost per egg consumed increases, thus decreasing the energy gained per egg consumed. This also means that bears who consume and come to the island to consume eggs earlier in the season will have a much higher energetic gain per egg due to being able to spend less time foraging for eggs. It is not as sufficient a source as the seals that they usually hunt in the winter, unfortunately. So thank you for listening and tuning in today. Here are my sources for my images and whatnot. And here are the journal sources that I used for the Galapagos marine iguana behavioral study portion. Thank you.